Hello, everyone. You're listening to Sinister Spotlight here on Mephisto's Castle. As you know, I am Jose, and for today's episode, something very, very special in store for you. My guest is none other than Mr. Will Errickson, who comes from the blog Too Much Horror Fiction. So, Will, I'd first like to thank you very much for being with us here tonight. It's a huge pleasure to have you on board.
Well, thanks. I'm glad you asked me. It's going to be fun.
Yeah, and it is going to be fun, and it's going to be different because as some of you may know, who have read Will's blog in particular, his passion is of course horror fiction, as the title implies. It's also something that I'm a huge proponent of as well, and we kind of just decided that we're going to make this particular episode of Sinister Spotlight kind of a horror fiction hootenanny or hoedown. I'm not sure which one it's going to turn out to be. Maybe it's going to be a hoedown of a hootenanny or vice versa or something like that. But it's going to be fun because we're talking about horror fiction and just our love for it, and hopefully impart some geeky knowledge and passion onto the listeners who are here with us tonight. So, Will, just to kind of start off, I basically wanted to ask you, since you have an awesome blog that's been going for a year or so now, and it's
Yeah.
really great. I basically wanted to ask you how did it all happen? When did you first have an idea that horror fiction was becoming a passion of yours, and what were your first books like, basically?
Yeah. I can remember being maybe kindergarten or first grade or something, and being in the library with my mom and looking for Dracula, trying to find Stoker, and I don't even know if I'd seen it in any of the movies at that point. And I cannot even remember where I first ever saw it. But I ended up finding a book, and then when I picked out Dracula from the library when I was about kindergarten, first grade, my mom, I think, read some of it to me as a bedtime story, and then after that, started seeing the Universals and the Hammers, and then read some abridged versions, young adult versions of Frankenstein, and then read Dracula, and this was probably early 80s. So then when Stephen King started getting big, my mom was bringing books home from the library to read, and I snagged them. And, Stephen King was just, becoming huge. All the movies, The Shining, The Dead Zone, that era. So it was a moment for, definitely for me, when I realized I wanted to read this stuff and not just watch the movies.
Right. So, did your attraction to the genre kind of occur simultaneously with your attention to the movies, or did one precede the other?
Um, it must have been about the same time,
Right.
in the sense that I knew that, like I was saying about, being 5 years old and looking for Dracula, I knew it was a book. I knew Frankenstein was a book. I certainly knew probably about Poe and maybe the Vincent Price movies or something. So I was always aware that these movies came from books and stories.
Right.
But it wasn't until I was probably 13 or so when I really started sitting down with the novels and reading them. So it was kind of simultaneous. But definitely as a teenager was when I really began reading.
Yeah.
Or I could read before that, but
Yeah.
I read a lot of Judy Blume. So when I was a kid, before the horror novels, but
Oh, nice. Yeah, I was never into the Judy Blume thing myself. That was more of a thing my sisters were into. But it was somewhat similar for myself as well, getting into the whole horror fiction thing. See, it's kind of funny because you talk about how, Stephen King was pretty much the biggest force in the genre at the time that you were growing up. And it was kind of funny because when I was young, for me, it was definitely, I got in touch with the movies first. I grew up on the Universal classics with, Frankenstein and the Phantom of the Opera, and it was pretty much the same thing. I knew that these were stories that, had existed for, when you're that age, probably like hundreds of years old, you had this idea of them. But, I knew the movies first, and I loved them. It's safe to say that by the time that I really started getting into reading, that I was pretty much, I knew that horror was going to be my thing. But when I was growing up, the funny thing was, up until like third grade, I was not the biggest reader. I didn't like reading at all. I preferred watching TV. I was, such a stereotypical kid.
Right.
And just kind of on a fluke, I picked up an entry into the Goosebumps series by R.L. Stein. Yeah. Yeah, and that's how a lot of, I think, people from my generation probably got into the genre, just because those were the books that were prevalent and kind of got, so many kids hooked on the genre. And, I gave the reading thing a try. I think my first real one was Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes, which is a slightly less prestigious title than saying, "Oh, my first horror book was Dracula," or something like that. But I started reading those, and they of course being marketed to kids my age and being horror, it was just the perfect bait. And next thing you knew, I was trying to read up on all the classics like Poe and things like that, and it just kind of took off from there.
Yep. Well, it's so funny you talk about the Goosebumps, and I knew you'd say that, because when those started getting popular in the late 80s and early 90s, mid 90s, I was working in bookstores that whole time. So I sold hundreds of copies of those Goosebumps books. And I remember at the one bookstore, it was a big chain bookstore, and we just hated it because they would come in such huge numbers, these kids looking for these books. And we were just always restocking them, and it was just all you ever heard at the time was, "Where are the Goosebumps books? Where are the Goosebumps books?" Like, that's all anybody was ever going to read if they were under the age of 12. But it's funny because I didn't think that back then, I was, for some reason, I didn't connect that these were going to be the horror fans of, 20 years from now or something. So it was a big headache, and now it's paying off with, turning people into real horror fans.
Yeah, it is really crazy, especially when I look back on it, because I'm sure to older people it just seemed like this silly little fad. These creepy books that probably weren't all that educational, of course, that the kids couldn't get enough of because they had monsters and all these things in them. But I mean, they worked. They served their purpose, and I started reading them, and that's really around the time that I first got the inspiration to start writing, and it just started a lot of stuff for me. But it's funny because when I look back at it now, it's probably safe to say, I mean, I don't think it's anywhere close in scale to what this latter-day example has become, but really the Goosebumps were kind of like the Harry Potter series of the 1990s, because
in a way, I mean, where it just sort of swept that age group, and there tends to be, it's also publishing and marketing, and that goes through waves and stuff. But I mean, it was just one of those things. It was everywhere, and it was a TV show, and then it all disappeared, and then suddenly, I'm reading stuff, and people are talking about Goosebumps, and I'm like, oh my God, all those kids have grown up.
Exactly. That's one of the things that's kind of bittersweet about it, because it's a really nostalgic thing for me. I just have, kind of like you mentioned with some authors that you read when you were younger, they're just in my DNA, that I can't part myself with them. As silly and trite as they may seem, I got like pretty much the whole collection still, and just looking through them, it's very funny. But yeah, when I see like there have been a few times when like Stein has tried to kind of revive the series. He did it just like recently in the past year, and as sweet as it is, it's also kind of tragic, just because, like you say, the kids that the books are marketed to aren't old enough to know what they are, and I don't think they'll probably take to them quite as they did in in my generation, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I can't say that I wouldn't have been reading them had I been a kid then, or if they'd been around when I was 8 years old, because I certainly looked for what I read, and I've seen other people talk about them, are these I think they were published by Crestwood. I don't know if it was something that was always in school libraries, and these orange
God
cover books. You know what I'm talking about?
Oh yeah. You just say the name Crestwood. That's right. I remember the monster movie books.
Yeah, they had the monster movie books, and I know that they're still in the school libraries, because my mom was a school teacher till just a couple years ago, and I would go and visit her, and I these are probably the same books. It was the same school system. It's like, these are probably the same books that I read, 25 years ago.
Yeah.
They were still there. So I just thought that was, I hadn't seen them in real life for that long. I just thought it was amazing. But those were definitely educational.
Yeah, exactly.
The stills, and you had to fill in the story, in your head, everything, because I couldn't just go out and rent them at that time.
Exactly. No, that's precisely it, and it's funny because it was around that same time in 3rd grade. I was actually in Arizona, and the school I was going to had those. Those were like the first books I happened upon on like my first day to school, and it was like perfect. I found those, and I was like, okay, yeah, we can stay here. We don't have to move back to Florida. We can just stay here, because they got these monster movie books.
That's
and
right.
it's funny because it wasn't until you did your little post about them at Too Much Horror Fiction that I realized how old they actually were.
Yeah.
It just dawned on me then that, holy crap, it's not like they created, and it makes sense, in retrospect, that those books wouldn't have come out, when I was going to school. They definitely have much more of a famous monsters, Monster Kid type aura about them.
Right.
Yeah. But no, yeah, that's the thing too. Those books were awesome because they kind of bridge the gap between me and the video store. Because when I couldn't go and see the movies, I would get these books, and you would see the stills, and you'd pretty much imagine the whole story in your head. They were awesome, tools for monster loving kids.
Yeah, I remember one still. I don't think this was in the Crestwood books, but it was a horror movie book, and it was in the kids section of the library, and it had a still or two from Andy Warhol's Frankenstein with Udo Kier, and that just flipped me out. I mean, they weren't even in color, but I think it was, like I said, the end with all the gore, and it had a couple stills, and your imagination is so much more powerful than the film could ever be. But I remember that really freaking me out. I was about 10 years old.
Yeah, I know. I even then I tried to find as many nonfiction books about horror as I could for the fiction ones, just because I was fascinated by the history behind the movies and all that stuff. And just seeing, I remember one book in particular, and I think it was called Monsters in the Movies. I love the hell out of this thing.
I'm pretty sure I know the book. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. What was that?
Was King Kong on the cover?
I don't think so. At least not the edition that I was looking at. I think it was kind of like a companion piece. There was another book that was very much like it. I don't think they were the same author, but the other companion piece was one on like silent comedy cinema.
Okay.
And this particular one was just about the early horror films, and they both had like the same illustrator. And as opposed to kind of like the orange tint that the comedy book had, the horror one was in green, and all the pictures inside kind of had this green hue to them. So,
I remember those too, for sure.
Yeah, and just reading those, it just completely fascinated me, because I would wonder what these movies were like that I would probably never see. This was before the advent of Netflix and anything as colossal as like genre-specific DVD companies. I don't think even DVDs were that prominent around this time. But it was funny because I would read about these movies, and it would prompt me to write my own versions of them, and it was kind of embarrassing in retrospect, because like my version in particular of Creature from the Black Lagoon, all the stories were pretty much the same. The monster would show up, it would kill some people, and then the hero would kill the monster. And I remember for my particular version of Creature from the Black Lagoon, for some unexplained reason, the hero managed to rip a fin off the creature's head and then stab it with its own fin. I have no idea. It's just weird stuff that kids think of.
That's your brain, yeah, when you're a kid, absolutely.
But yeah, those books, they're such a, now people may kind of underestimate them, but, to a kid who didn't have his own, Blockbuster account or anything like that, they were the world. They were, yeah. But that kind of bridges the gap to something else I wanted to mention. We talk about how this has been a love and passion of ours, these books, both fiction and nonfiction. I wanted to kind of ask you, what is your perspective of what do you think it's like to be a horror fiction fan in contemporary society? Is it particularly challenging finding the books and finding other people who enjoy it just as much?
Well, there are different aspects. One, specifically since my blog deals with vintage horror fiction and the older paperbacks, they can be a little tricky to find now, like in used bookstores, because bookstores don't want to take them. They want the $8 Jack Ketchum reprint. They don't want the $1.50 Graham Masterson from 1977, which is what I want.
Exactly.
So I've had better luck probably like at a thrift store or something with that. So for me myself, or somebody with my taste, it probably is a little difficult. Although of course with Amazon selling used books and eBay and everything, you can usually track this stuff down, and if you're patient, you can find it for cheap, because there's no fun paying $25 for a first edition of, whoever, a Richard Lehman paperback, or anybody that wasn't huge at the time, and finding it versus finding it for 50 cents at a library sale.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I come in. That's what I like to do, is find it that way. But then say for people who are reading all the new stuff with the e-readers and everything, there's so much of that. I mean, it's beyond me, as far as both technologically, because I don't have any kind of e-reader and I don't plan on getting one, but there's so much out there now. I see it on other blogs, either writers publishing their own stuff or established writers just going right to the reader. So
right.
I think for those kinds of readers, there's plenty of stuff out there. And I think it's sort of going through a boom again. I think also because people who grew up in the 80s and 90s reading, say, either Goosebumps or like Clive Barker, Peter Straub, people in the late 80s, the splatterpunks, suddenly they're like, wow, I can just write my own book and basically publish it.
Yeah.
That's probably real, that's real exciting, and the readers are out there for it. But I don't know. I haven't read any of that stuff. I mean, I'm still, looking for my vintage paperbacks.
Right, and the whole e-reader kind of craze, it almost seems like it would, I mean, I'm sure it's not going to extinguish it completely, but do you think that it kind of puts a deterrent on the whole collecting aspect of being a horror fiction fan?
I don't think it's a deterrent. Obviously the people who have their e-readers aren't really, I've got to have the physical book,
Yeah, same here.
It's a little peccadillo of mine. So I don't know how it will affect it. It will, I can see it going both ways, where old paperbacks suddenly shoot up in price because people are realizing that everything's on e-reader, and to actually get an old copy of the book, it makes it more rare. But then on the other hand, I can see how people are just like, who wants these, damn dirty old books, get rid of them, and, sell them for a quarter. So I don't know how that's going to play out. I don't know.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. It really could go either way, I suppose, from here. It's also interesting to note, too, on your blog, you like to spotlight some, names that might kind of have gone under the radar over time, especially, with the, giants like King and Coons and Straub and Barker kind of eating up the field, so to speak. But who, in your years of blogging and just reading, rereading some of these books, are there any particular names or writing personalities who you think should really gain more attention than they have in past years?
Well, yeah, and I think some of them are coming back with the e-reader boom, or with some people republishing paperbacks. I know one of my favorites is Thomas Tesser, who wrote Finishing Touches and a handful of, and he's still writing stuff today. He's got his own blog and everything. And,
cool.
What's that?
I just thought that was cool that he has his own blog.
Yeah, yep. And yeah, he's one of the guys actually that saw my reviews of some of his books and commented on there and corrected me about a couple tiny things. So,
nice, very nice.
Yep. But his stuff is, I remember reading him back in the late 80s, early 90s. They just looked like regular paperback horror novels, but I picked them up and they were just really just brilliant and perverse. And I found, rereading them last year, that it was even more so. It just really held up, and I just didn't even remember how good it was. So I think Thomas Tessier is somebody that they have been reprinting finishing touches and the Nightwalker and maybe some of his other stuff with ridiculous covers, but they are reprinting them. I think you can get them in mass market paperbacks now,
awesome.
Which doesn't happen to a lot of writers. One of my other favorites, is just mentioned Graham Masterton, the vintage 70s guy who I knew all about through the 80s, but I never bothered reading him. He just seemed to publish a book every 2 months. That turns me off,
yeah.
But when I read The Manitou last year, it just blew me. It was just so much fun, and just this great pulpy vintage, ridiculous, but really grotesque and fun monster book, and vaguely Lovecraftian. He throws in some of that, and then I find he's just got some great old vintage paperbacks with great covers, so I'm excited about reading more of them and collecting more of them. Another writer, she's still writing, is Kathy Koja, who started out the Del Abyss paperback line,
right,
in the early 90s, which was right when I was just totally ready for that. And she's turned to writing young adult novels, and that is, she's got a blog. I've talked to her once or twice through comments and stuff, which was pretty cool, because I read her first novel, The Cipher, about when it came out, and I was just blown away. It's just this gritty, grimy, punk rock, existential nightmare, just really dark, and rather than dealing with like American families, like say Stephen King or Dean Koontz or something, it dealt with like the sort of burgeoning alternative culture and kids, crashing in squalid apartments, and they're some kind of avant-garde bullshit artist, and it just really struck me the right time, and I've read that a few times over the years, and it's really held up. But I think her books her paperbacks starting to go for collector's prices, but mostly she does young adult stuff now and teaches creative writing, I think, in Detroit, wherever I know is where. So she's definitely somebody people should know about. But I mean, there's a million of them,
Yeah, for sure. I do recall, pretty much all the reviews that you did for those respective authors' work. Thomas Tessier, in particular, I've been reading, some like nonfiction stuff, like the best, the 100 best horror books that Jones and Newman put out. His name is brought up a lot, actually, especially in their recommended reading section. And it's kind of funny because you hear these names, especially the ones that come up frequently, like Tessier's, and you have to the everyday Joe horror fan, they had no idea who these people are, right, and what they've done. So it's it's always kind of interesting and funny to find there are these people who have been really prevalent in the field, and you had no idea that they even existed.
Well, that's just that's going to happen really in any genre or subgenre, where somebody's got a big name. I mean, nobody knows outside of fandom. The people don't really know who Harlan Ellison is.
Yeah,
which is outrageous. I'm not talking about. I'm talking about Harlan Ellison. You know? And it's probably because they never made one single big movie out of any of his stories. With Harlan Ellison, such and such.
Yeah.
But it's astonishing, that guy's got how many books, how many short stories, wrote for Star Trek, is just,
Yeah, so he's a giant.
he's a giant, but, people know who Isaac Asimov is,
or
Ray Bradbury, or something like that, but, no, Harlan Ellison, no, it's just, so yeah, if Harlan Ellison can't break out of the genre to sort of American mainstream name authors, then somebody like Thomas Tessier, sorry to say,
true,
and that's no slight against Tessier at all, but you know what I mean?
Oh, sure, yeah, and it's incredible to think that. I didn't even stop to consider Harlan Ellison, because I mean, if you're
always stop to consider Harlan Ellison,
he'd probably tell you that, yeah.
That's true, he would, wouldn't he?
But no, it's funny because somebody who's even remotely acquainted with literature or has at least a minimal interest of it, the name has to have come up at least once somewhere. Whether you're, reading, especially like Stephen King's Danse Macabre, he comes up in there quite
That's
a
where
bit.
I first heard of him.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and it's funny because if anything, you can't forget him just because of his personality and who he is. He's just one of those unforgettable people. But yeah, it's crazy to think that he hasn't, as huge as he is, he's so kind of minimal in the mainstream scale. Just because
Yeah. I mean, I think some of it is he's had a problem with publishers.
True.
And this is going back, decades and decades, and his books were fall out of print, and they've been bringing back in print, and there'd be rumors that everything was coming back in print, and so now most of his paperbacks aren't even available. They're fairly big collector's items. I buy them. I don't buy them every time I find them. Honestly, if I'm in a bookstore, I will sometimes think, "I'll leave this for the next person who's never read Harlan Ellison." I've already got a copy of Desperate Stories or Strange Wine or whatever, because sometimes I've got a couple copies of some of the books, and I've definitely left them there for for other people, because that's not fair for me to hog them all up, because I've read most of it. I'm just collecting it now, so sometimes
right.
I'll leave it there and give it a pass.
You're paying it forward. You're paying Harlan Ellison forward to somebody.
That's right.
But now, his stories are really phenomenal from what I've read of him. I mean, just you take, for instance, I know we're kind of highlighting Ellison here, but it just it just occurred to me, wow, a lot of people don't know about him, and yet he's such a. It's funny because he's inspired so many other things that people don't realize. There's a whole
writer's writer.
Yeah,
he's kind of a writer's writer. If you saw the documentary on him, it came out a year or two ago. It's him hanging out with Robin Williams. And I'm not necessarily a Robin Williams fan, but talk about two motor mouths.
Right.
And apparently they've been friends for years and years, which I guess doesn't really surprise me. But it was nuts. It was like, who could stand to be in a room with those two?
Right. Oh, God forbid if they're drinking, right?
Yeah, exactly. I don't think Harlan is. He's like Gene Simmons. He says he's never had a drink, really.
Really? Huh.
Yeah. And because I've read, he would write these articles that were like restaurant reviews back in the 80s in LA. And he's just so much fun when he writes about, random stuff about Los Angeles. And, he wrote something wrong about a drink and got all these complaint letters. He's like, well, I don't drink, so I don't know what's in a Cuban Mai Tai or whatever. It was some crazy cocktail. And so he's like, for all you sons of bitches out there complaining, here's the recipe, or something. Like, do I have it right now? So I do know that about him. I don't think you'd want to see him drink.
Oh God, yeah, that would be something quite almost as epic as his Star Trek motion picture plotline, something of grand proportions.
Yeah, and one of the things I love about, this sounds funny, but one of the things I love about the internet is I can just go on YouTube and Google Harlan Ellison and find all these crazy talks that he gave throughout the decades, which I could only imagine when I was a teenager reading his essays and thinking, this guy must be amazing to go listen to. And so I get to, that's really paying off for me, the YouTube.
Oh yeah, no, there's the whole treasure trove of wonders out there.
Yeah, that's just that one point I have to make.
Well, something I wanted to touch on about horror fiction too, is the fact that, in horror films, something that's relied on, particularly in, more modern theatrical examples, is the jump scare. It's not like it's that's the only scare that's in a horror film, but it's it's there and quite frequent. Yep. I wanted to ask, since horror fiction really can't have a jump scare, words can't really sneak up on somebody, or they could, in a strange way. I want to ask you, if not a jump scare, how do you think that horror fiction scares people? How can it scare somebody, basically, is what I'm asking.
Like his analogy to a jump scare, because I can think of like some of the last lines of like Lovecraft story.
Oh yeah.
That to me, I mean, maybe that's more of a Twilight Zone twist, but the way it just, it leads up, but it's also not really a jump is a jump scare. I always think of a jump scare as like when the cat jumps out of the
Yeah.
cabin. You know, it's like a fake scare because it's not really the killer. But either way, I think of some of those Lovecraft endings, and it really just takes a mastery of writing. I mean, I'm not scared too often by horror because it takes such great skill that and a lot of times people are just almost like in a pulp way pumping these books out. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying poorly written, but I've been so like physically frightened of a book. Just, you know, Salem's Lot, Dracula, Pet Cemetery, maybe a short story, probably a Lovecraft story here or there. So I don't know how have the word sneak up on you. That's a good way. It really can just be something as poetic as, you know, you start a new paragraph, or you sort of stick it in the middle of the paragraph, and, you know, like you say, you just the writer carries you along, you know, and he's leading you. So hopefully he's got that skill and dexterity to be able to give you a jump scare, and you were like, well, I wasn't expecting that. It's a book, but I think it can be done. It just it's so the mechanics of it have to be precise, and a lot of writers who write hard, you know, they can maybe write violence or suspense, but to just like boom get you, I don't know. I think that's difficult.
Yeah, it is, and personally, I find I can get creeped out by fiction. I know I can at least get creeped out by some of the stuff I read, and I find that there are more or less two ways that kind of most effectively do that for me. One way, that this is the one that I see a lot more in fiction, is it kind of works the same way, more or less, as a jump scare. You know, the narrator or the lead of the story, the protagonist that we're following, will just kind of be doing something, you know, mundane or innocuous, or they'll just be observing something.
Right.
And then when they notice, you know, the ghost or the bogey or whatever it is, they say, the writer phrases it in such a mundane way that it kind of catches you off guard. Like, you know,
Yeah.
they'll be maybe like just walking through a bed of flowers, you know, looking at all the different, flowers and whatnot, and then, you know, they'll just say, as she glanced down, she caught sight of the pale white hand sticking out of the earth, something like that. That's something that just kind of like catches you off guard, and you're like, wait, what just happened? There's a corpse in the flower bed or something like that.
I think that's exactly right. That's what I was thinking, and to have that, you need to master your rhythm so that you're lulling the reader into a sense of, oh, this is a normal, you know, walk through the, you know, traipsing through the flowers, and then boom, there's that. So it can be done. You know, it can be done, but, you know, filmmakers just rely on that. So it's become such a cliche joke, and now it's like the two jump scares right in a row. So like, oh, it's just a cat, but you know they're gonna do it, boom, right again, 10 seconds later.
Yeah.
But you're watching horror movies, you get the rhythms. So.
Well, no, yeah, and it's funny because I love how they played on that, and as you know, as silly and, you know, kind of stupid movie as it was, I love how they played on that in Scary Movie when the chick goes out into the garage, and first she jumps out at the cat, and then she jumps when the horse is in the garage all of a sudden, and it makes a noise. You know, that it's you know, funny when the artists behind it kind of pick up on the own cliches that they're kind of setting.
Right.
But yeah, you mentioned a good thing too with the final lines, particularly in short stories. When authors utilize those can really pack a punch sometimes.
Probably Lovecraft's The Outsider, even though that's like one of his more Poe-esque stories, if not the most Poe. That the final line of that, I think, functions that way, and it was sort of, I know it was one of his earlier stories, and he used that later and just got better and better at it. You know, Shadow Out of Time has that, and you know, so it's there, or At the Mountains of Madness. You know, they all have this sort of last line done with horror where it explains everything. You know, so and I was just such a sucker for that, and kind of still am. You were saying were two things that worked for you?
Yeah, that was actually the second thing. The slightly Twilight Zone-esque final line that just leaves you, with that last chill, and it can be delivered differently. It can be just kind of straightforward. Like the story that immediately comes to my mind thinking about that is Dress of White Silk by Richard Matheson. And that's, it kind of works along the same lines as Born of Man and Woman, where the narrator is, doesn't have the best spelling, and, the sentences are kind of warped, not very grammatically correct. And the crux of the story is that the narrator is obsessed with this white silk dress that I believe the narrator's mother was buried in. And, the story goes on, and the narrator, it sounds like it's a child, brings a friend over, and something happens. It's a very short story. Something happens, and, it's not explained in detail, but at the very end of the story, the narrator is saying to us, he or she mentions eating, and then he finally says, "It's okay, though, I'm full."
Right.
And it's like, whoa, I'm not sure what just happened, but I think I have an idea of what just occurred. There's an ending like that, and then there's something like a Charles L. Grant story, which, I love a lot of his stuff just because he has, very quiet, sneaky kind of horror, which I really like. But one story that I know of his that kind of utilizes that, but in a slightly different way, is When Damon Comes, I believe it's called. And it's a prominent theme in a lot of his stories where this father is haunted by the ghost of his son.
Yes.
And he rushes into the house to, call his ex-wife and, basically as a last resort to, tell somebody that he's being chased by the specter. And as he's doing this, we're hearing Damon's thoughts or voice as he's getting closer and closer to the house, and it goes back to the dad on the phone and crying, and then it goes back to Damon, and then the last line is by Damon, and it says, "I'm home." And it's, it's just one of those chilly little things that totally freaks with your mind, and I just love shit like that.
I remember the story. That was good.
Yeah, it was in I read it in The Dark Descent.
The Dark Descent.
Yeah, that huge-ass anthology.
Overall, I have mixed feelings about that anthology. I don't know. I just feel like they picked a lot of stories that seemed, I don't know, either trying too hard to be, I don't know if it's literary or, I don't know. There are other anthologies that I like better, but,
yeah. Well, no, I see where you're coming from as far as The Dark Descent goes. It's definitely it definitely has a lot more literature contributions in it than your average horror anthology would. I kind of like it because, first of all, it's giant, so I mean, if for anything else, it's I think it's a pretty good volume for a burgeoning fan to kind of acquaint themselves with, just because of the mass ground it covers.
Yeah.
But I did notice that it does have a lot of high literature type of names and writing in it.
What threw me off was that some of the stories were by sort of some of the more literary science fiction people.
Yeah.
It seemed like an odd fit. Like there was a Gene Wolfe story in there and a Michael Shea story.
Yeah, Thomas M. Dish is in it too.
Yeah. And then sort of almost like that sort of new wave of science fiction that was big 8 years ago. And maybe I felt that those stories, I was like, they're like, I don't know what they're doing here,
Yeah.
Okay, it's a creepy science fiction story, but I didn't, I didn't see why they were there, and I think that's what sort of pulled me to that anthology. But
yeah, it does have some quality stories to boot, though. I mean, it does have that If Damon Comes, which is one of Grant's better ones. They're all really good. God, I can't. There are some like It's funny because if you're a huge fan of horror anthologies, which I am, you definitely start to pick up on which ones everybody anthologizes. Everybody and their grandmother has to like include young Goodman Brown, which is a great story, but it's in like all of the collections. Most of Poe's stuff is in everybody's collection.
Yeah.
But you know, I kind of like to.
Was it the Faulkner or Rose for Emily?
Yep, Rose for Emily is in it, which you know. Which one was that?
Yellow Wallpaper.
Yep, Yellow Wallpaper's in that one too. Yeah, just you know, a bunch of them that you see in a lot of collections. Call of Cthulhu's in there.
It has doesn't it have Carl Edward Wagner's Styx?
Yes, which is an awesome story. That is a really good story. That's one of the better ones.
Yeah, that was a big coup for me a couple years ago, and really started thinking about starting a horror blog. Was finding those two short story collections of Wagner's. In a Lonely Place,
right.
And Why Not You and I. And I remember them from the 90s and sort of reading them, and I don't know what happened to my copies, and then I think, I don't know, I think I came across it on eBay or something for real cheap, and I was like, oh, I remember having that book, I'm going to go ahead and get it and reread it, and I was able to get both of those, which are long out of print, and and I was like, okay, you know, I guess it was after I read Styx, In Dark Descent. And I was like, I've got to get the rest of this stuff.
Yeah.
It's not print anymore. So.
Yeah, I haven't read too many of his other stories, but he seems, you know, definitely like a, you know, wonderful kind of undiscovered horror writer. Kind of funny too, because he was known for his anthology work. He collected the year's best horror stories for the longest time, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
I knew him that, and he was in Cutting Edge, the Dennis Etchison anthology, which I read in high school, and in Silver Screen that David Scow did.
Yeah, that's right.
He just had some solid like stories. He did one of the things that I really like is horror that's about writers, professors, particularly, or it's sort of an inside thing where, you know, sort of meta, where it's a horror writer or it's a pulp fiction writer, and David Scow has done that, you know, obviously Harlan Ellison and stuff like that, you know, King has always done it, but Carl Edward Wagner did it in sort of like a real contemporary kind of guy that was like going to the horror conventions or the science fiction conventions and mixing in obviously like real life romantic entanglements and everything. And I just thought that stuff was just a lot of fun to read. You know, you get the horror, but you also get like the horror writer's life.
Yeah. No, it's funny because, you know, I love, you know, stories like that too. One of my favorite films is The Ninth Gate because of Johnny Depp's character, the book collector. And it's funny because I think, you know, people like you and I take to those so much because those guys are kind of like us because, you know, we relate to them just because they're because they're into the genre, and then they have these horrible, you know, horror story things happen to them.
Absolutely.
You actually mentioned too, when we were talking about Wagner just now, that he was partly the inspiration for the creation of your blog, Too Much Horror Fiction. How did the blog really come about? Was that entirely it, or was there some other contributing factors to it?
I had slowly started rereading some of my old paperbacks. I think I had found, like we were just talking about, The Dark Descent. I'm pretty sure it was about 4 years ago I found a copy of that for, you know, $1.50 or something. It was like, oh, I should start rereading some horror stories, or, you know, read stuff I missed back in the day. And I think I just started rereading some of the stories, and it whetted my appetite. And then I started finding the paperbacks cheap, and it was actually specifically it was the guy who does the Retrospace blog, Gilligan.
Yeah.
And he covers you know, all kinds of retro pop culture, and he had one post wondering, with some, you know, scans of vintage, some of these horror novels, wondering why nobody had ever started a blog on vintage horror. You can find vintage science fiction and pulp crime and, you know, old dirty books and anything like that. You know, that's real. That's what the internet's for. You know, is reliving that nostalgia for that stuff. But nobody did. I started doing some Google searches, and literally just went away that evening and scanned the Joe Lansdale and I think the Carl Edward Wagners and some David Scow, and started it up. It was really that was it. I had some of the books right there, and Gilligan wondered why, and I was like, I'm doing it. You know, my girlfriend was like, "What if you do it?" And I did it, and that was it. And it was off and running, and it was easy to start finding books for cheap and everything. And I got to read stuff that I missed back in, when I was a teenager, and reread stuff and see that some stuff was better than I remembered or worse than I remembered, or just some of it was just charmingly dated and and whatnot.
Yeah.
So it was just a lot of fun. It was just totally a labor of love, and I started slowly getting more and more feedback on it, and that's what you do. When you find that there's an audience, you're like, okay, I'm not just talking in an empty room, and it's cool. And I've had that. Maybe I'll find a blog. I'm like, I didn't know anybody else ever heard of this movie or this book or whatever. And how many times haven't you? You find, and it's just like, so now I'm on the other side of that, and it's it's fun to hear from people who are like, I hadn't thought about that book in 20 years, and whatever. So.
Oh, definitely, yeah. There's definitely an audience for your particular blog, just because you do revive so many old memories for so many people. I mean, even me, I'm probably the youngest of the lot, and I read the geekiness for horror fiction that your blog puts forth is pretty much what attracted to me too. Yeah. Even though I might not have read all the titles, but yeah, it's fantastic place, and it's just it's always a thrill to finally hear somebody like drop a name that you didn't think anybody else but you knew.
Absolutely.
And that's why the internet is such the blogosphere in general is such a cool place to hang out, because you find those people who you thought you were the only fan in existence, and turns out there's at least 20 of you.
Yeah, at least, yeah. It feels so good to get it out of my head.
Oh yeah.
Because in all the in the bookstores I worked in bookstores for about 10 years, and there were very few people that read horror on the level, or not on the level, but to the extent that I did. And every now and then I'd run into somebody, and they were like, yeah, we could go toe to toe with it. But certainly wasn't something I studied in college or chatted with friends at work or anything like that. So it's good to write about this stuff, and this idea about this book has been rattling around in my head since I first read this book, in 1989 or whatever. And I just appreciate a lot of them, and like I said, a lot of them are a little embarrassing and whatnot. But that's part of the whole ride. That's part of the fun.
Yeah, exactly.
Hello, and welcome to a commercial for Hello, This is the Doom Show. I'm Richard.
I'm Brad.
And on the podcast that is known as Hello, This is the Doom Show, we talk about giallo movies, slasher movies, horror movies.
We're going to interview Cary Grant live in the studio.
We're going to interview Lucio Fulci in the studio, folks. We're going to put Cary Grant in the studio with Lucio Fulci. It's the interview you never thought would happen.
I'm going to wear my Vincent Price slacks.
I'm going to wear my Citizen Kane wristwatch and monocle. And now Brad is going to recite the Pledge of Allegiance in Portuguese. Brad, go.
I don't know Portuguese.
Go! Go!
Stop hitting me!
You're a natural actor.
Yeah.
You can listen to us at HelloDoomedShow.podomatic.com, or you can find the archive at DoomedMovieThon.com.
Your blog, speaking of, kind of covers a certain area year-wise with horror fiction, and it's roughly about you cover some stuff in the 50s to about early 90s, correct?
Yeah,
and it's basically I've asked you actually in a previous interview just why you do that, and your answer to me was basically that that was especially getting into mid to late 70s and all throughout the 80s practically. That's when horror was at its just largest output, book-wise.
Yeah.
I mean, and I boggle, even as oft-told a story as it is, I still boggle at the idea that, it wasn't just Stephen King, but really, I mean, he's the one who popularized the idea of horror books being hardcover bestsellers.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you had the flukes before that, like, I don't know about flukes if that's the right word, but Rosemary's Baby, or
right.
You could sort of consider The Exorcist horror in that sense, or The Other, and it's something also that I was thinking about before I started the blog was horror before Stephen King.
Yeah.
Horror fiction before him, and not like the classic pulp stuff, but like best-selling horror before that. And you have like Rosemary's Baby and that stuff, and The Other, and Harvest Home, Thomas Tryon. And so I just started thinking about that. I was like, that's kind of interesting, because when you look at the old Stephen King paperbacks, you see his name's real small, and and I just love, like, before superstars became superstars, and it was just another mass market book on the drugstore rack.
Exactly.
And absolutely, after The Shining, the publishers realized this was hardcover bestseller stuff, and so obviously to talk about horror fiction and talk about Stephen King is almost. It's almost the same thing, and it's almost redundant, because saying, oh, Stephen King influenced everybody, or it's almost like, well, we all know that already.
Yeah.
I can't really add much. I can't add much to that. Millions of horror fans, millions of non-horror fans have read his stuff and would have never even dreamed of picking up, or have maybe even never even heard of Peter Straub, even though he wrote books with him or something. I know from working in bookstores that people who read Stephen King or Dean Koontz a lot of times don't have any interest in horror fiction whatsoever.
Yeah, which is really weird.
Yeah, they just read it because it's on the bestseller list or because they like their books. But I learned it was useless to recommend, virtually anybody else.
Pretty much.
Clive Barker or Ramsey Campbell or something. And,
even Poppy Z. Bright.
Or Poppy Z. Bright. I mean, all those people were not doing the same thing as those guys. So I can see why there, wasn't always a crossover. So at least probably with like older people, like probably teenagers, I think, younger people, younger men were probably more into reading horror stories and stuff. But some, 50-year-old, woman is not really, she might like a Stephen King book now and then, but she's probably not going to, go searching for Guyan Smith or something.
Right. Yeah, that'd be a sight.
I'm sure that they're out there, but
yeah.
In general, I knew when I was working at bookstores, if they'd asked me what was good or something and they were buying a Stephen King book, I could easily just say, well, Robert Ludlum or, John Grisham, and they would just be as happy with that.
Oh, yeah.
So.
Well, I kind of wanted to ask you, too. I mean, do you think there was any 1 or 70 specific reasons why the publishing of King's novels made horror such a big time best selling thing? Like some people would probably say, oh, it was the society at the time that it just was as big as it was, but I kind of wanted to ask you maybe what your hypothesis was on just how and why King became so big. I know it's kind of a tough one.
It's enormous, Why is Charles Dickens considered, the greatest 19th century writer? I mean, it's all those factors. I mean, and Dickens is probably as apt a comparison as anything. I think they just, I don't know if because they did Carrie right away, and maybe his name got known a little bit more through the movie.
Right.
It came out pretty much the same time as his first novel. And then Kubrick doing The Shining a few years later. I don't know how much they worked in tandem, like with Clive Barker and Hellraiser.
Yeah.
And his section, that all worked together, I think. But people just, people connected with him, and I think that, where I was saying where he offers something that, say, a Clive Barker doesn't for the average bestseller kind of reader, his stuff is very comfortable and very identifiable, and very immediate and very cinematic,
True.
And none of that hurts, for a best-selling writer. And you just believed him, you just believed what he was writing, I think.
Yeah, well, that, like you say, it was kind of a tough question for me to ask, but I just, I can't help but marvel at the idea of, it's hard for me to perceive it just because I've grown up in the times that I have of, just horror being so hot and at such a rapid rate as it did, all those years ago. So, yeah, I just can't help but ponder about it sometimes.
It's just, a lot of it is they'll just publish whatever the audience is there to read. If it's 12-year-old girls or, whatever, like I did with when I was posted about the zebra book covers, and how they reprinted some stuff that had been, printed in the 70s and had these cool, real 70s looking covers. And of course they want to reprint in the 80s, but they just gave them the most terrible, generic skull and rib cage with a, skeletons with a clown hat or something.
Yeah, and the evil kids.
Yeah, and all the evil kids and stuff. And obviously, that was something a teenage girl was going to buy. Mm-hmm. But so it sort of filters down to, okay, well, we know people like to buy horror and hardcover, and we also know people like to buy, just spend $2 to buy crappy paperback. So if we put Skull on it, people buy it. Maybe they found that as the 80s went on, if there was too elaborate of a cover, people would think it was, think it was a comic book or something. I don't know. If you look at some of this stuff in the 70s, we had great, paintings and stuff. So they were just, marketed to a different crowd. They found that those men from the 60s and 70s that liked those kind of book covers weren't really buying books. It's generational. It's the audience, that's out there that's going to dictate all that. And, all the publishers wanted to get in on horror because they saw that's what hardcovers were doing, Stephen King and Peter Straub. And they're like, we're going to have our whole horror wing, publish all these crappy horror novels and saturate the market. And, I think that was probably when people really started to look down on horror, because they saw these terribly covered books in the store rack. Come on, I think that's where you sort of joke about, I want to be caught dead reading this, this book with this deformed baby on the cover or whatever.
Yeah, it's just that stuff that you'd definitely be embarrassed to be caught reading on your downtime.
Some people don't have that. Some people don't care. I don't know. I don't know if it's a snob or something or what, but now, because I remember at the time thinking, God, these book covers are terrible, but at the same time I was reading Lovecraft or Barker or the Poppy Z. Bray or the Delabis books or anything like that, and I don't know. I guess I just thought those books were much more refined than the googly-eyed, demon or whatever on a zebra paperback.
Yeah, at least slightly more refined.
Slightly more, yeah.
Something else I wanted to mention as well. This is, a pretty age-old argument that I see, particularly in horror. I'm not sure really if other genres go through the same type of debate, but something that I find is mentioned a lot in horror fiction is kind of the argument between novels versus short stories.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you see where I'm going with this, but you have the one, I'm not exact, it's really, it's not so much the novel supporters are trying to fight the short story supporters. It's the short story fans saying that and even horror writers themselves have gone on to say this, that the genre is best represented in the short form because in a short story, you basically, since horror is more of a genre, it's, an emotion, as others have said, in a short story, you basically boil it down to all the base elements that you need. You don't have any fodder or, any extraneous crap that you would have to fill a novel with. Right. So they say that, short stories, by that virtue, are generally more, effective or scary, depends on your phrasing, than a novel would be. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think there's merit behind both arguments?
Well, yeah, again, it's that singularity of effect that you can do in a short story, Poe's idea that, every word, every image, every phrase you've got to do way so much more, and a lot of times the scenes in a novel that in a long novel say that are the horrific moments function as that's kind of a short story. It's almost like you could almost take it out and there's a story.
Yeah.
But as far as what's best, it's kind of I guess it's sort of also apples and oranges, because people like to read novels. If you're talking about like a mainstream audience, people like to read novels. A lot of people don't like to read short stories. They like to sneak in, with a novel that they can read all night,
True.
That kind of thing. But I think genre fans like short stories because they appreciate the sense of it's all leading to one point, just have sort of emotion you're going for. And but as far as me, I mean, I like both.
Yeah.
I definitely read short stories where at the end you're like, either you're like, wait, what happened, or because they were going for one effect, but it was just too diffuse. They just didn't get it right. And read novels that are just tight and concise, and firing on all cylinders.
Yeah, exactly. A good example of that, I think, is one that you believe had similar sentiments on. I mean, Rosemary's Baby is one of the tightest horror novels I've ever read. It's just so economic and effective. It's crazy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, it's and that's one of those interesting books that, is it horror or is it not?
Yeah.
That's another sort of eternal debate. And it functions as sort of a black comedy too, which I think gives it an extra layer. But yeah, he's just in and out with it, Levin was also a playwright.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
He probably got some of that conciseness from being a playwright.
Very true. Very true.
And Clive Barker was a playwright.
Yeah.
I don't know how many people know that he was a playwright and an artist for years before he started publishing the Books of Blood.
See, I didn't know. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I had to interrupt. I didn't know actually that he was a playwright before. I knew that he did, the History of the Devil and the Frankenstein play.
All that stuff's from the late 70s and very early 80s.
Oh wow, I did not know that.
He was doing that in London at the time, and I think that served him well for a lot of the Books of Blood stuff. Because, he could imagine this stuff and he knew how to get it down on page, because he also had to, because some of the grotesqueries in his plays, he had to direct. Probably the makeup people, how to come up with this stuff, so he could see it perfectly in his mind's eye. So he didn't have, it wasn't so much the gore in Barker's Books of Blood stories; it was just this panoply of grotesque, what kind of monsters, what kind of things are these?
Yeah.
All these glistening, inside out. Cancerous.
Yeah, the son of celluloid, and then you had the midnight meat train creatures,
and erotic zombies and everything.
Yeah, the pornographer's shroud, the
right.
sheet. Yeah.
And he just, I think that was one of the things that made him so big, was that his eye in his mind's eye he was just so adept at putting this stuff down. I think some of that came from the playwriting. Because he described it to a bunch of people, and it was already there when he did the Books of Blood. He had been thinking about that stuff, I think, and he just knew exactly how to get it down. He was already a practiced writer. So, so that just is an interesting comparison. I thought about how Levin and Barker were both playwrights. That's not really someplace you see horror writers coming from.
Yeah, for sure. It's always interesting, I think. What's that?
You talk high culture,
Yeah, right. No, it is very interesting to note that comparison. And I think that's I've always been kind of upset that wasn't a field that was quite as represented as frequently as literary fiction and things like that. Because me being a theater buff, it's always cool when I see horror themed stuff. So it's. I'd love to see like a Levin play or one of Barker's plays, someday, just to see their black creative eyes, on stage. That'd be a great treat.
Yeah. So I think it was Frankenstein in Love. I read a few of them years ago, and I wasn't sure how they were going to be, and because I knew they were early in his career, and I was like, wow, he just had it right from out of the gate, you know? All the dialogue, all the descriptions, the scenarios, the plots, it was all just so Barkarian right off the bat. I don't know if you've seen the first few Cronenberg movies, but it was similar to that, like Shivers or Rabbit. He was just Cronenberg right from the beginning.
Right, that's crazy.
Billy Dowling finding his themes, figuring out his angle of attack. Those guys just had it right out of the gate, and I think that's pretty profound.
For sure, yeah. That their creative minds were just like sharpened right from the offset. And just, I mean, if you're a horror fan and you haven't acquainted yourself with either one of these individuals' works, then, it's high time that you do, for sure.
Definitely, without a doubt.
But you actually mentioned, you briefly alluded to something that I wanted to mention as well when we were talking about the novel short story debacle, is the kind of fluidity of the horror genre. It's that's another area that's been debated a lot. More so when it comes down to classifying a book or some type of work, film, anything, any type of creative work as being horror. And, you have people who say, well, if it has, like, foggy castles and vampires, then yeah, it's horror, obviously. But then you start, especially with, when you start digging really deep, kind of getting back to the contributions from the sci-fi writers and the Dark Descent volume, that's when you really start to question, okay, what exactly is horror? How do we determine where's the line? How do we separate, Thomas M. Dish story from a Clive Barker story? And, something that we talked about is, and you actually mentioned it in one of your reviews for Silence of the Lambs, how do we determine if Silence of the Lambs or James Ellroy's story is a crime novel or a horror novel? And in the the 100 best books, the Big Nowhere is actually mentioned as a recommended reading.
Oh, was it? I missed that.
Yeah, it's crazy.
My old punk rock band was called the Big Nowhere.
That's awesome. That's very awesome.
I don't think Ellroy would have been too happy with that, but we did have some songs about murdered women, so you might have liked the lyrics.
Yeah, that counts.
Well, this is a topic that I particularly thrive on because I feel like I can argue it from every angle.
Yeah.
But I remember years ago, in the days when you would call in video stores, I was just looking in the horror section, and there was this, sorority on her, frat boyfriend or whatever, just two normal kids, and the girl was like, why is Jules in the horror section? And I just wanted to turn around and grab and just scream into her face, because when a shark eats you, it's considered scary. And that was my knee-jerk reaction. But, Jaws is also, an adventure story, men against nature, men against themselves, men against each other, so it has all those elements. But at base, it's about a giant animal that wants to eat you, which is about the most horrific thing I think that humans can, imagine. That, we're just meat, that these animals just want to eat us.
Exactly.
I mean, that's horror. That's horror. But then on the other hand, I can see where some people don't want to be associated with the horror genre.
Mm-hmm.
That Splatterpunk's book that I just reviewed, virtually none of the writers in there wanted to be called a splatterpunk or even like being called a horror writer. But that's a little different than, a particular book or movie. But Ellroy, his stuff is really dark and violent, and I think it's not so much like, do we think that could be considered a horror novel? It's a crime novel I would definitely recommend to horror fans. Where other crime novels like Raymond Chandler I might not necessarily recommend to horror fans. But Ellroy, it's so black. It's definitely a book, like Black Dahlia or LA Confidential, I would definitely recommend to horror fans. Whereas, say, James Lee Burke or Raymond Chandler or Elmore Leonard, I don't know if the average horror fan would see anything in those. If they were looking for gore or perversity or something,
Right.
But yeah, Silence of the Lambs, obviously it's about a cannibal and a serial killer. And that's the basis of horror, but it's so much also about the politics of the FBI and the forensics, and the it's not really a mystery because we know what's going on. The characters know.
Right.
Generally, I see people go, it's a psychological thriller or whatever, but like you say, it was Douglas Winter who said, talked about horror as emotion, and so it wins its way, this rich vein of darkness through all kinds of movies and books. So I think a lot of stuff falls under the horror, umbrella, definitely. But I think it's probably more important for fans of horror to know that this darkness is out there in places that you wouldn't normally think of it. So they can go to it and be, enlightened and entertained by, a crime novel or, a classic or something.
Right.
Heart of Darkness or something like that.
Exactly, yeah.
Or, even years ago when I was reading Dostoevsky stuff, I was surprised at how intense and violent his stuff was. It was like a Scorsese movie, That definitely appealed to the horror fan in me. Axe murders and stuff like that. And, it's not just about, it says horror on the spine and it's got a jack-o'-lantern on the cover.
Exactly.
And it just happens that crime is the genre that probably, definitely more than science fiction, slides in horror, but I don't know how much that audience crosses over.
I find that a lot of, it's hard, even for me sometimes, when it comes down to questioning, what is horror and what isn't horror. And at the end of the day, I think, it's important for not just me, but for everybody to say that, it's more important not to seek these things out based on classification, so what if it isn't really called horror? I mean, that darkness is still in there, and if it's, the darkness that attracts you, then, just seek it out in whichever form it may come in. I mean, some people will tell you that I myself, I'm usually not afraid to tell people, and I get weird reactions when I say this, I'm not afraid to tell people that I think Lord of the Flies is a horror story, or, something like that. So, at the end of the day, I think it's more important to just try to appreciate it all than, split hairs and say, well, it has a, cannibal cross-dressing serial killer in it, but the atmosphere isn't the same. I think you should, if there are certain elements that attract you to a genre like, say, horror, then it's just best to kind of seek those elements out, like I said before, and just however they may come.
Yeah, and you can look at the history of how, say with Jaws, originally, what was it when the shark, fairly basic Hollywood lore, but when the shark couldn't work, Spielberg said, suddenly my movie went from William Castle to Alfred Hitchcock.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's, it's a great way of looking at it, because originally I think they wanted to use the shark more. That was how all the storyboards were, so it was going to be a monster movie. William Castle,
Yeah.
And, okay, happy accident. And I know Stephen King is a big fan of Lord of the Rings being considered a horror novel, or at least something that affected him when he was a kid. He's written about that.
Right.
It threw up something unexpectedly after finishing it. He was 12 years old or whatever. So.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to ask you as well, since this is an aspect of the blog that's pretty prominent, and you kind of touch upon it during the reviews and discussions of the books that you spotlight, I kind of basically just wanted to ask you to impart some knowledge on all of us on what exactly goes into the whole book hunting, collecting aspect of your journeys, so to speak. Are there certain things that you look for, certain names, certain covers and editions? Is there anything that you can kind of give us clues as to maybe if we want to start doing this stuff? It's
I've always been a book nerd, whether it's horror or other genres or stuff. I worked in a used bookstore when I was a teenager, and I guess that's really where I got the taste for it. But I'd love to visit bookstores in any new city, or haunt the ones that are here in my town and stuff, and some days I'll just have a sixth sense, and I'll go, oh, I'll go swing down to, bookstore downtown or whatever, and boom, I find two Mathesons and a Shirley Jackson and a, David J. Scow,
Nice.
and occasionally, I don't find anything, but say Silence of the Lambs that I just reviewed. The reason I read that last week, I wasn't even planning on it, but I found, the non-movie poster cover. So I was pretty, as a book nerd, I was like, okay, this is what I like. I don't want to have the movie tie-in edition, not the novelization I'm talking about, but just like the book with the new movie poster cover.
Right, which a lot of them do have after the movie comes out.
Exactly, and I always like to find the editions from before that.
Yeah.
So I'm always looking for for something like that. If something like a Exorcist, or I've got a nice old copy of Rosemary's Baby, although that's not too hard to find.
Yeah.
But so I'm always looking for mass markets. They reprint everything generally in trade paperback editions, which I am not really a fan of. As far as like condition, that's why sometimes I don't like buying books online, because booksellers don't know what they're doing. And if you bought books online, you know what I'm talking about. They don't know the difference between what good used condition means, as opposed to what was one description on eBay I saw, book in perfect condition except missing first 5 pages or something like that. And I was like, my girlfriend says that's not a book, that's trash.
Internet, it has its ups and it has its downs.
Some people, they just have no idea, and so I've definitely gotten some books where I was like, and I'll comment back and try to put it, but I was like, it's not gently used if it's got a big library sticker on it. Come on, people. I'm looking really, for the stuff from the 60s and 70s, and a lot of the tour stuff from the 80s is getting harder to find.
Yeah.
I think the best bet is for people to haunt thrift stores, library sales, flea markets. I know a lot of people might know this already, but I found, this is a little outside of what I collect, but I found 3 Harlan Ellison hardcovers a couple months ago. The White Wolf reprints from the 90s, they wanted $1 each for them. It's like, yeah, I'll take those, sure. So I think those are the places, but I definitely found stuff on Amazon that I've been happy with, and you gotta watch those collector's prices.
Yeah.
They want to charge you $59.99 for a first printing of some Skip Inspector or was it that vampire novel, Delicate Dependency?
Yeah, I remember you talking about that one.
Remember that?
Yep.
I literally found that like within a week. I found 2 copies, one at a library sale for 50 cents, and one in a used bookstore in the same town for $1.
Suck at Amazon.
And somebody's on eBay trying to sell it for $1,100. Now it's down to $60. I don't know where they come up with these prices. If they have some, algorithm or what, but it's nuts. And there's no, like I said, it's no fun. People are like, oh, I just want to get the book. I don't care if it's the new vintage, reprint edition, vintage, the crime publisher. It's like, no, I gotta have that. I gotta have that whole paperback. And some used bookstores just only carry all the, the paranormal, romance, the horror section, and it's all,
yeah.
True Blood stuff and paranormal romance, which is fine, but I'm not going to find any Shirley Jackson in that mess.
Yeah, no Mathesons, no blocks. It's depressing.
Yeah. But I think that just like any book collecting, no matter really what the genre, it's just knowing where to go, how to find that stuff, as far as knowing when somebody's got something that's worthwhile and they don't know it.
Yeah.
Because collecting anything, I suppose.
Yeah.
That's pretty much, I guess that's the bottom line of collecting, because I don't think it doesn't really count to me, like you're saying, I got, a paperback of I Am Legend, I paid $60 for it, which I've seen on Amazon. It's like, no, I found it for $0.10, in somebody's garage.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened to it. I had a great old first paperback printing of a Kerouac novel called The Subterraneans, with the most amazing, like, beatnik 50s, dude on the, just this amazing, like, sort of impressionistic art. And I found it for a dime at a library sale.
That's good.
And I was just looking around like, oh my God. So it's stuff like that. I found out that was years and years ago, and I think it was something like that that, like, whetted my appetite for, finding cool stuff for really, really cheap. And, I'm going to have to move soon probably because of my collection. But
yeah, well, best of luck with the moving thing. I'm sure that could that's a hassle when you have a good collection on your hands. But we're kind of winding down to the end here. It's been great conversation. I think I'm such a geek for this stuff. So, but I basically wanted to ask you, even though you make a point to say that you're really not all that familiar with contemporary horror fiction or anything like that, I kind of wanted to just ask you anyway, overall, I mean, just when it comes to films, fiction, all that good stuff, do you think the genre's in good hands? Do you think that it's at a low point, or do you think that it's actually at a high point? What are your thoughts as far as that goes?
I think like it's definitely in a high point, and every now and then, some friends of mine, who I know are horror movie fans, and there's this sort of, cool attitude of, they don't make them like they used to. It's like, well, one, they are making great movies right now, and two, they've always made crap movies.
Yeah.
So I don't, it's just that whole attitude. They don't do it like they used to. There's always been crap. Horror fiction, I can't speak too much to. I see it's hugely popular. With the e-readers, there's a lot of authors I know that there are different magazines. That Rue Morgue magazine is one of the best horror magazines.
Yeah.
It covers all aspects. And so I think that there's still lots of fans out there. And I think there's fans for different aspects of horror. I've seen some of the books that seem a little more like ghosty, Shirley Jackson style stuff. And then there's the extreme, bizarro, post-splatterpunk kind of stuff, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
With the real gory, ridiculous covers and everything, and they look more like comic books to me. But, that's fine. That's fine. But I think that you have that choice under horror. Okay, sure. All right, it's not the 1980s, and it's not tour books putting out all this stuff, or that era, of the groovy age of horror that was. They don't put them out like that. That's true. They don't have them like that anymore, which is a shame. But you can still find those books because the internet's so much easier to find that stuff now. So that's good. Horror fans can read, just have such a huge selection at their hands, whether new stuff or old stuff. And as far as horror film, I'm continually. It's been about 10 years that I've read. I think it was the Lovecraft adaptation Dagon, and then Ginger Snaps. I think about 2000, 2001, where I was like, okay, horror is going to be. Horror's getting better and better.
Yeah.
Our film has a future, and over the past 10 years, it's just gotten better and better, and stuff goes straight to DVD that's not bad, or goes straight to Netflix streaming, and they're good. In fact, if it skips the movie theater, it's probably better than what's in the movie theater.
Probably, exactly.
So yeah, I don't think, I think if you like ghost stories, or you like gory horror, or you like psychological, serial killer thrillers, I think all that stuff is just, it's another golden age. We talked about remakes before. I don't have that knee-jerk reaction against remakes. They can be good. They've always remade horror movies. There's no difference between Dracula being played by a bunch of different people than Freddy Krueger. I don't get all wrapped up in that.
Yeah.
If the remake is good, it's good. I'm not necessarily against it. Now, I don't want to see a remake of Suspiria or Jaws tomorrow. Absolutely, but and it probably gets some kids who are interested to go back and watch the original Texas Chainsaw or whatever. Even that Night of the Living Dead remake from the 90s, from 1990, was pretty good. And
yeah.
The remake of Dawn of the Dead had a fantastic zombie mayhem opening. So, mainstream horror or underground, I think, it's having a blast, watching stuff on Netflix and collecting my old paperbacks, which are so much more available now. So it's a good time to be a horror fan, definitely.
Well, that was a beautiful way to put it, I think. And yeah, I share most of your sentiments. I think that it's, like you say, it's a great time to be a horror fan because high or low, it's being put out there. And as hipster as you may want to approach it, there is good stuff, whether you choose to acknowledge it out of coolness or not. But, if you look hard enough, if you're really devoted to finding this stuff, you'll find it. And whether if it's film or fiction or what have you, it's there either way. Yeah. So, yeah, it's, it's been great talking to you, Will, and, definitely something I was most passionate about. Much more IV once you start reading it, it's that essential. But horror fiction, there's so much out there to be offered, old and new, and Will's blog is a great place to go to learn about some of the older stuff. So, Will, thank you again so much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Alright, and again, thank you all for taking the time to listen to this episode of Sinister Spotlight here on Mephisto's Castle. Have a great night.